Sometimes the quietest roads lead us to the loudest truths. When a poor mechanic stopped to help a wounded stranger on a cold mountain road, he never imagined how deeply that moment would change both of their lives. What began as an act of simple kindness soon unfolded into something neither of them expected: a journey of healing identity, and the kind of connection that can only be found when everything else falls away. If stories of resilience, redemption, and quiet love speak to your heart, we invite you to stay subscribed and join us for this unforgettable tale. Now, let's begin. A poor mechanic bandaged a woman's bleeding foot. She was a billionaire walking away from it all. Wyoming, late autumn, the mountains breathed cold into the valley that day. Dry, silent, ancient air that whispered over the cracked asphalt and rattled the brittle weeds that clung to the roadside. Earl Danner had just finished draining oil from a '92 Ford pickup when he spotted something moving along the shoulder of the two-lane highway. At first it looked like wind-blown trash, some pale scrap tumbling along the ground. But then it moved again, slowly, deliberately, and Earl saw that it was a person, a woman, walking barefoot on gravel, cradling one foot with each careful step. He wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag, narrowed his eyes against the glare of the sun sinking behind the pine ridge. She was maybe 50 yards out, her coat too thin, her steps uneven. Something wasn't right. Earl tossed the rag onto the workbench, grabbed his keys, and stepped into his beat-up Dodge. The old engine coughed awake as he turned onto the highway and rolled slowly toward her. She didn't look up as he approached. He stopped a few feet away and stepped out, leaving the engine running. "Ma'am," he called gently, not wanting to startle her. "You all right?" She hesitated, her eyes wide and wary lifted to meet his. They were the kind of eyes that had seen too much, too fast, storm gray, rimmed red, and alert like a deer about to bolt. "I'm fine," she said hoarsely, shifting her weight and nearly stumbling. "Just walking without shoes?" he asked, glancing at her feet. Blood stained the arch of her left foot, already dusted with dirt. The other looked raw from the cold. "I had to leave in a hurry," she muttered, eyes darting to the tree line. Earl noticed now that she wasn't just hurt, she was scared. "Look, I'm not going to ask questions," he said, taking a cautious step forward. "But it's going to be below freezing in a few hours and your foot's bleeding. I've got a garage just back the way you came. It's warm, got coffee, clean bandages." She looked past him toward the waiting truck, then down at her feet, then back to him. "You don't know me," she said slowly. "Nope," Earl agreed, "but that doesn't mean I can't help." The silence between them stretched thin. Then with visible reluctance, she gave a slow nod. The garage smelled like motor oil and pine cleaner. Earl guided her inside and motioned to the faded leather chair near the heater. She sat gingerly, still watching him like he might change his mind. "I'm Earl," he said, kneeling in front of her with a first aid kit. "Mind if I take a look?" She shook her head and he carefully lifted her foot onto a folded towel. There was a deep cut along the heel, dirty but not too far gone. He cleaned it with warm water, then antiseptic. She flinched once but didn't complain. "You've done this before," she murmured. "My wife." He stopped, corrected himself. "My late wife used to be accident-prone. She always said I was better than the ER." She didn't respond to that, just looked at the framed photo on the workbench. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a mischievous grin, standing beside Earl in front of a Christmas tree. "You live alone?" she asked quietly. "Yup, just me and the radio. Sometimes a stray cat shows up for leftovers." He finished bandaging the wound, then offered her a pair of thick wool socks and an old pair of slippers. "They're a little worn, but better than gravel," he said. She accepted them without a word, fingers brushing his for the briefest second. Her hand was cold. Too cold. "Want something hot to drink?" She hesitated again, then nodded. They sat in the tiny break room, a battered thermos between them and two chipped mugs steaming in their hands. Earl didn't press her with questions. He'd learned long ago that silence often gave people the space to speak. "My name's Claire," she said at last. "Claire James." It rang oddly familiar, but he didn't let on. "Nice to meet you, Claire." "I wasn't planning to stop," she said, eyes fixed on the mug. "I just kept walking. I didn't even think about where. That's usually when you end up somewhere you're meant to be." Earl said, half smiling. Claire gave a soft, almost bitter laugh. I doubt that she looked around the garage again. The old maps tacked to the wall, the dusty radio playing low country tunes, the grease-streaked calendars. "This place feels like something out of time," she murmured. "Like the world stopped turning here." Earl shrugged. "I like simple things make sense in a garage. Something breaks, you fix it." Claire's voice turned brittle. "And what if it's not something you can fix?" Earl looked at her closely. Her expensive coat had a tear at the shoulder. There were faint smudges of mascara under her eyes, and her lipstick had long since worn off. But beneath the tired lines and guarded expression, there was something noble, like a woman who'd once commanded rooms, now learning to move unnoticed. "You'd be surprised," he said softly. "Even the worst engines can be rebuilt, just takes time. And knowing where to look." They sat in silence again, the hum of the heater filling the space. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharp with suspicion. "You don't know who I am. What if I'm dangerous?" Earl leaned back, took a sip of coffee. "Don't reckon you'd let me wrap your foot if you were planning to stab me?" Claire stared at him, then unexpectedly she smiled. Just a flicker, but real. "You're different," she said. "Everyone I know always wants something," Earl chuckled. "Well, I've already got my coffee, so I guess I'm good." And for the first time that day, Claire laughed. It was quiet, unsure, like a sound she hadn't made in years. Outside, the wind shifted. Snow was coming soon. But inside the little garage, warmth settled like a blanket, thick with something neither of them had expected to find that day. Not safety, not certainty, but something close enough to hope. The next morning broke gray and quiet, with low clouds snagged on the ridge and frost dusting the pine needles outside. Earl stirred before sunrise, as he always did, and lit the wood stove in the garage before checking on the woman sleeping in the back room. Claire was curled under a patched quilt on the narrow cot, breathing softly. She hadn't stirred when he'd set the extra blankets by her side late the night before, nor when he quietly placed a folded sweatshirt nearby in case the cold crept in deeper. He paused at the doorway, now watching the rise and fall of her chest. She looked different in sleep, less guarded, almost delicate. The bruised weariness that clung to her yesterday seemed to have softened, but only just. Earl left her be and started his morning routine: coffee, old gospel tunes on the radio, and wiping down tools from the day before. The rhythm of work steadied him, as it always did. There was something comforting about engines and grease. Something predictable. People were far messier. An hour later, he heard the soft creak of the floorboards. Claire stepped into the doorway of the garage. Her arms crossed over the borrowed sweatshirt sleeves, too long for her hands. She'd washed her face, but there were faint shadows under her eyes that even rest couldn't erase morning. He said, not looking up from the carburetor he was cleaning, "Coffee's hot." She hesitated, then walked over, wrapping her hands around the warm mug he handed her. They stood in silence for a moment, steam curling between them. "I should go," she said. Finally, Earl didn't answer right away. He simply set the carburetor down, wiped his hands, and leaned back against the workbench. "You're welcome to stay until that foot of yours heals. Road's not going anywhere." Her eyes met his, wary again. "You don't even know who I am." He gave a slow nod. "That's true. You told me your name. That's enough for now." She studied him, as if trying to understand why he wasn't pushing harder, why he hadn't already Googled her or turned her in. People always ask questions, demanded answers. Earl strangely didn't. "Why aren't you curious?" she asked. "Oh, I'm curious," he replied with a small grin. "But I've learned that sometimes people aren't ready to be found. They come to places like this when they're trying to breathe." Claire blinked, taken aback. The truth of it hit her like a soft hammer, unexpected and clean. She sipped the coffee to hide the sudden tightness in her throat. "I didn't plan to end up here," she said. "Didn't even know which direction I was walking. I left the car behind. Left the phone too. I just kept going." "You running from something?" She hesitated, then gave a weary half nod. From everything, Earl didn't pry. He simply nodded and motioned toward the open garage bay, where the sun was starting to break through the low clouds. "I've got an old Honda that needs a new battery and a lot of patience. You feel like keeping your mind off things? I could use an extra pair of hands." Claire blinked. "I don't know anything about cars." "Even better." He said, "No bad habits to break." The hours passed in quiet, companionable work. Claire held tools while Earl explained torque and timing. with the slow, patient tone of someone who found peace in teaching. She listened, nodded, and asked questions that didn't give away who she'd once been. They talked, but never too deeply. Earl mentioned his wife Sarah, and how cancer had come fast and cruel. Claire listened, surprised by how plainly he spoke about grief, like it was something that had settled beside him, not something he fought. She didn't speak of her own loss. Not yet, but it pulsed beneath the surface like an old bruise. Later, when they stopped for lunch, Claire sat on the back steps watching the wind chase golden leaves across the gravel. She hadn't felt this untethered in years. No board meetings, no staff, no calendar full of people who needed her to make everything work. Just cold mountain air, the smell of pine, the aching throb of a healing foot. She didn't belong here, and yet some part of her didn't want to leave. I used to think I had everything, she said aloud, surprising even herself. Earl, sitting nearby with a sandwich in one hand, didn't interrupt. I had money, property in 3 states, a company with my name on every product. I thought that meant I'd made it. But he asked gently. She looked down at her hands. But I couldn't sleep. I'd wake up every morning with my chest in knots. I spent years building a life I didn't want to live. She glanced over, expecting disbelief or pity. Instead, Earl just nodded. Funny thing, he said, when Sarah got sick, we realized how much time we'd spent chasing things that didn't matter. Promotions, perfection, big plans. In the end, she just wanted to sit on the porch and hold my hand. Claire swallowed hard. It's strange, she said softly, how the world applauds you for burning yourself out. That world forgets what hands are for. Earl said, tapping his mug. They're not just for holding power. They're for building, holding, bandaging. She looked at him, not in the way people look when they're searching for a crack, but like someone finally realizing they're safe enough to rest. For the first time in years, Claire didn't feel like someone's leader, someone's solution, someone's symbol. She just felt human. That night she lingered by the fireplace in the back room, wrapped in the borrowed quilt. Earl had left her alone after dinner, sensing she needed quiet. The logs cracked softly as flame danced shadows across the walls. Claire held the mug of tea close, staring into the fire. She hadn't told him who she really was. Not yet. Not because she was afraid he'd use it against her, but because she didn't want this place to change. She didn't want the air to tighten. She didn't want to become the billionaire again. Here she could just be Claire. Here she could exhale. The days settled into an unexpected rhythm. Quiet, slow, unspoken. Claire had planned to leave after one night, 2 at most. Yet by the 3rd morning she found herself waking before the sun rose, drawn not by obligation, but by something far gentler. The hum of a heater, the faint scrape of tools, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the garage. Earl had already been at work for an hour, sleeves rolled up, his breath visible in the chill of the early hour. The sight of him wiping oil from his hands and gently coaxing life from rusted parts was oddly comforting. She lingered at the doorway for a while, holding the mug he'd set out for her, without being asked. He always made 2. Sleep all right, he asked, not looking up. Well enough, she replied. He nodded, and that was it. No interrogation, no unnecessary small talk. Just 2 people standing on opposite ends of a garage surrounded by tools and silence. Claire had been surrounded by people for most of her adult life. Advisors, assistants, security shareholders. But no one had ever made her feel quite as seen as this man who never pried. That evening, after a slow day of sanding down a dented bumper and learning how to coax stubborn bolts loose, she sat on the porch swing behind the garage. Earl joined her after locking up the tool shed, carrying 2 mugs of cider this time instead of coffee. The sun dipped behind the mountains, leaving only streaks of amber, and rose along the horizon. You always live this quiet, she asked. Since Sarah passed, he said simply. Noise didn't do much for me after that. Claire sipped her drink. Don't you ever get lonely? He considered that. Sometimes, but I'd rather be lonely in peace than surrounded and hollow. She looked down at her hands, remembering the dozens of rooms she had walked into, full of people, and how alone she had always felt. Do you miss her? She asked after a pause. Earl nodded. Every day. But I also talk to her every day. That helps. Claire tilted her head. You talk to her, he gave a small smile. Out loud sometimes, sometimes just in my head. When I'm working or when something good happens, even when something breaks. Especially then, Claire swallowed. There was something beautiful and painful about the way he said it, as if grief for him wasn't a prison, but a conversation that never ended. I haven't had many people like that. She admitted anyone who just stays Earl didn't flinch at the confession. He simply sipped his cider and let the silence fill the gaps. People these days don't know how to stay, he said after a moment. They get bored or scared or distracted. Sticking around when things get hard, that's a different kind of love. Claire turned to look at him, eyes soft. You're full of quiet wisdom, Earl, he chuckled. Mostly I'm full of black coffee and bad knees. But I've been around long enough to notice things, and I've learned that listening's more useful than talking most days. Claire felt her throat tighten. She'd spent decades talking, pitching, negotiating, defending, commanding. She wasn't used to this kind of silence, but it didn't press on her. It cradled her. You know, she said gently, you're the first person in years who hasn't tried to sell me something or get something from me. He looked at her, then really looked, and there was no awe or fear in his gaze. Just quiet honesty. I don't need anything from you. Claire, he said, least of all answers. She turned away, blinking quickly. The air had gotten colder, or maybe it was something else making her shiver. They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the wind rustle the trees, the porch creaking softly beneath them. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, I was supposed to be on a private jet yesterday morning. Earl didn't move. I canceled it. She continued, walked away from the airport, got in my car and drove until I ran out of gas. I left everything behind, my title, my staff, my fiancé. She let the word hang in the air like smoke. He was chosen for me. You know, a merger dressed up as a love story. The press was going to eat it up, Lockwood Global uniting with Wellington Industries. Stock prices would have soared. She gave a bitter laugh. We even rehearsed our proposal. Can you believe that Earl stayed silent? I think I was supposed to feel honored, she said. Instead, I felt trapped, like I was performing a version of myself I couldn't stand. The wind picked up, lifting the edge of the blanket around her shoulders. I didn't even tell anyone I was leaving, she said. They're probably searching for me now. Earl nodded slowly. So you're not just walking away from a life. You're walking away from the version of you the world built. She looked at him, startled by the precision of his words. Exactly. And who's the version sitting here now, he asked. Claire blinked. I don't know yet. Well, Earl said gently, that sounds like someone worth getting to know. She smiled, then really smiled. It wasn't the polished kind she gave to cameras or shareholders. It was raw, a little tired, but full of something new. Trust. For the first time in years, she let the quiet be enough. Earl stood, stretched his back, and turned toward the door. I'll leave the porch light on, just in case you decide you want to stay another night. She nodded. And as he walked inside, Claire sat alone beneath the stars, the mountains standing silent guard beyond, and felt something she hadn't known she was missing until now. Stillness. Not the kind that echoed like loneliness, but the kind that promised she was finally somewhere she didn't have to perform. Somewhere she could simply be. Rain came on the fourth day. Not the storming kind, but a steady soft curtain that blurred the trees and pattered against the tin roof of Earl's workshop. It smelled like earth and pine and something older than memory. Claire spent the morning inside, watching droplets race each other down the window pane. She had planned to leave again twice now. She'd even laced up her boots this morning, only to find herself sitting back down, hands frozen on the shoelaces, heart refusing to follow the plan her mind had made. Earl didn't mention it. He simply set a bowl of oatmeal in front of her at breakfast, along with a side of blueberries that were clearly rationed from a freezer stash. Storm might last a day or two, he said, good for staying in, bad for hurrying off. Claire had smiled barely. Her foot had improved enough to walk without limping, but the ache in her chest hadn't changed. If anything, the quiet here had only made it louder. By late afternoon, the power flickered, then blinked out entirely. Lines out again, Earl said calmly. Lighting an oil lamp. Happens a few times a year. Nothing to worry about. I've got a generator. But let's see if we can get by old school for a bit. Claire followed him into the small living area at the back of the garage. He knelt at the fireplace, stacking logs with practiced ease. Moments later, a fire crackled to life, casting flickering warmth into the space. The shadows softened the rain, a whisper on the roof. She sat on the floor near the hearth, arms wrapped around her knees. Earl settled into the armchair nearby, a cup of something warm in his hand. "I haven't sat in front of a fireplace in years," she murmured. "Shame," he said. "It's where most of life's real thinking happens." Claire turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "Earl, do you ever regret not chasing more? A bigger life? More success?" He didn't answer right away. Just watched the fire, as if waiting for it to speak first. "I chased enough," he said eventually. "When I was younger, I thought I had to prove something. Fix more cars, earn more money, get noticed. But after Sarah got sick, none of that mattered. What mattered was time. Not money, not reputation. Just time with her, with the quiet. That's when I realized success isn't always louder. Sometimes it's softer than we expect." Claire looked down, fingers tracing the stitching on her jeans. "I don't think I've ever known that kind of success." He glanced at her. "What kind have you known?" "The measurable kind," she said bitterly. "Revenue expansion headlines. I took a company from nothing to a global name by 35. I had calendars scheduled 3 years out. Private jets, rooms full of people who stood when I walked in. But I was hollow. I didn't even notice it happening. At some point, I stopped remembering what I actually liked." She paused, swallowing hard. "My mother always said I had to earn my seat. That women in power didn't get second chances. I believed her. I worked harder than everyone else, made every decision. 10 moves ahead. I curated myself like a product, every word, every dress, every step." Her voice dropped. "And I forgot how to be a person." The fire popped quietly. Outside, the rain came harder, pressing against the glass like it wanted in Earl. Spoke softly. "You remembered enough to walk away." Claire gave a hollow laugh. "Maybe, or maybe I just broke." He shook his head. "There's courage in breaking. It's what you do after that makes the difference." She turned toward him, the light from the fire catching in her eyes. "Do you really believe that?" she asked. "I do," he said. "Because that's when the real living starts, when you stop performing and start choosing." Claire let those words sink in her chest tight. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, with a tremor in her voice, she added, "I wasn't just walking away from my job. I was walking away from my wedding." Earl's brows lifted, but he said nothing. "I was supposed to marry someone named Jeremy Wellington, billionaire, second-generation legacy. The wedding was a media event, a merger disguised as romance. I let it happen because it was the right move. The powerful move." Her voice cracked. "I looked at him that morning and realized I didn't even like who I became. When I was with him, I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror, and suddenly all I wanted was to disappear, to find a place where no one knew my name." She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, firelight warming her face. "I didn't expect to find it here," she whispered. Earl leaned back in his chair, the cushion creaking beneath him. "Well," he said, "I didn't expect a barefoot woman with a bleeding foot to show up at my garage either. Life has a funny way of doing that, sending the people you need when you're not looking." Claire looked at him, really looked, and something shifted between them, something unspoken but real. He wasn't asking anything of her, not her name, not her past, not even her gratitude. He was just there, and that somehow was everything. The fire burned low, rain softened to a drizzle. Claire rested her head against the brick hearth, eyes fluttering closed, the weight of the last decade sliding off her shoulders. She didn't know what tomorrow held, but for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't afraid of the question, and for now, that was enough. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the rain washed away and replaced by the sharp scent of wet pine and wood smoke. Steam curled from the garage's stovepipe as Earl stoked the fire, and Claire stood in the doorway with a mug of coffee between her hands, watching the light touch the mountains like a slow revelation. She hadn't slept deeply, but she had slept honestly for once, without sedatives or a calendar looming overhead. Earl emerged from the tool shed a few minutes later, carrying a small crate filled with spark plugs and oil filters. His steps were steady, unhurried. She had come to recognize the way he moved, Not with the forced urgency of corporate time, but with the deliberate rhythm of someone who understood patience. Morning, he said, setting the crate on the workbench. Hope you're ready to get your hands dirty. Claire smiled behind her mug. What are we fixing today? He nodded toward an old blue Chevy El Camino parked just outside the bay. The paint had faded to something between denim and rust, and one of the headlights dangled like a loose tooth. This one's been sitting too long, Earl said. Needs new spark plugs, some coaxing, and maybe a little prayer. Claire set her coffee down and rolled up her sleeves. I can do coaxing, she said, but I'm not sure about prayer. Earl chuckled. Well, lucky for you, I cover both. As the morning warmed, they worked side by side, Claire on the passenger side fender, Earl on the driver's. She watched how his hands moved sure, gentle, capable, like someone who didn't just fix machines, but understood them. He explained each step as they went, how the carburetor breathed, how to recognize the stutter in an engine's rhythm, how a clogged filter could choke even the best engine silent. Claire listened closely, absorbing it all. It's funny, she said, wiping her hands on a rag. I've been responsible for over 30,000 employees. Oversaw billion-dollar acquisitions. But this, she gestured to the open hood, this feels more real than any boardroom I've ever sat in. Earl didn't respond right away. He pulled a spark plug from the socket, examined it, then handed it to her. Because this, he said, doesn't pretend to be more than it is. A machine's honest. If it breaks, it tells you. Doesn't play politics. Doesn't wear a mask. Claire looked at the blackened spark plug in her hand as if seeing a piece of herself. Do you think people can learn to be like that again? She asked. Honest, simple. He met her eyes, wiping sweat from his brow with a sleeve. I think most people want to, he said. They're just scared it won't be enough. Her breath caught. That was it. That was the fear. That if she stopped being Claire Lockwood, the billion-dollar CEO, the woman in heels and power suits, there'd be nothing left that mattered. No worth, no voice. Do you miss that life? She asked, the fast one. The version of you before all this. Earl leaned against the car. Arms crossed. I miss being young. Sometimes, he said, and I miss Sarah more than I can put words to. But I don't miss pretending I had it all figured out. Out there, it's all about what people think of you. In here, he gestured to the garage. It's about what's true. Claire nodded slowly. It's strange, she murmured. I spent 20 years chasing rooms where I had to perform, and here in a dusty garage with a man who doesn't ask anything from me. I finally feel seen. Earl gave a small smile. Maybe because you finally stopped running. The words landed in her chest like the click of a wrench finding its fit. She looked at him, this man with gentle hands and a steady gaze, and wondered if she'd ever met anyone quite like him. He wasn't charming in the usual sense. He wasn't polished or poetic, but he was real, and real Claire was learning was rare. They broke for lunch on the back steps, the sun warming their faces as they sat with paper plates balanced on their knees. Sandwiches, apples, chips. Nothing extravagant, everything enough. Claire found herself telling him about her childhood in Vermont, how her father had left when she was 7, how her mother became steel overnight, teaching her to never depend on anyone. Earl listened without interrupting, just nodded and chewed thoughtfully, like he'd already known somehow. Sometimes I wonder what I'd be if I'd grown up somewhere like this, she said, glancing at the gravel lot and the line of trees beyond. Would I be softer, kinder? You're plenty kind, he said. Claire snorted. Not the version of me they print in Forbes. Maybe they never met the real one. She looked down his words, stirring something both painful and gentle inside her. After a long silence, she asked the question she hadn't dared voice before Earl. Why are you helping me? He looked over at her, his expression thoughtful. Because someone once helped me. He said, a stranger after Sarah passed, I was a mess. Angry, bitter, lost. This old man came into my shop, watched me cuss out an engine and said, son, you don't need to fix that car. You need to fix your heart. Then he bought me coffee and sat with me in silence for an hour. Didn't say much, just stayed. Claire blinked. You never told me that. I didn't think you needed it until now. He stood brushing crumbs from his jeans. People think healing is a destination, he said. But sometimes it's just a roadside stop with someone who doesn't ask for anything. Claire looked up at him, her throat tight, and for the first time she realized she didn't just admire him. She trusted him with the truth, with the silence, with the fragile thing beginning to take root in her chest, something that looked a lot like hope. It was nearing the end of the week, though. Neither of them had mentioned what day it was. Out here, the calendar didn't seem to matter. There were no meetings to rush to, no alarms to jolt them awake. Just the natural rhythm of cold mornings, the hum of tools and the low murmur of conversation that deepened like the grain in old wood. Claire had traded her blazer for Earl's old flannel shirt and a pair of jeans that were a bit too long. Her polished nails were chipped, now her once pristine hair tied into a messy knot. But for the first time in decades, she didn't care. She liked the way she looked in the mirror, ordinary, unremarkable, and somehow finally real. Earl was under the hood of a red Jeep that morning, legs sticking out from beneath as Claire handed him tools. The air was cold enough that her breath still fogged, but her body had adapted. She could feel her strength returning, not just in her muscles but in her spirit. Wrench Earl's voice called from under the Jeep. She passed it to him and sat down on the stool beside his toolbox. "You know," she said, "this isn't exactly what I imagined when I thought about getting away." A muffled chuckle came from beneath the chassis. "What did you imagine? Cabana boys and coconut drinks, I imagined." "Nothing, honestly," she said. "I didn't think that far ahead. I just knew I had to leave." He slid out, wiping his hands on a rag face streaked with grease and calm as ever. "But I also imagined I'd fall apart without the noise," she added. "Turns out silence is addictive." Earl leaned back against the Jeep and folded his arms. "It's not the silence, Claire. It's the absence of expectation." She looked up sharply. "You don't have to be anything out here," he continued. "Not a leader, not a brand, not an answer to anyone's problems. That's what makes it feel like peace." Claire felt the words settle deep into her chest. "You say that, like you've lived both sides of it. I have." "Just not the billionaire version," he said with a grin. Claire laughed, then turned serious. "You really don't miss any of it. The rush, the applause, the feeling of being needed." Earl shook his head slowly. "People don't need a man like me, Claire. They come to me when something breaks, I fix it, then they move on. But here's the thing, I've come to love the simplicity of that. I don't have to impress anyone. I don't have to sell anything. I get up, I work with my hands, I listen to the wind in the trees, and sometimes I share coffee with someone who's got more weight on her shoulders than she lets on." Claire stared at him, overwhelmed by a feeling she couldn't name envy. Not of his tools or his workshop or his solitude, but of his wholeness. Earl wasn't rich in any way the world measured wealth, but he was full of integrity, of kindness, of quiet certainty. He'd faced heartbreak and didn't harden. He'd known loss and still chose gentleness. She envied that because everything she'd built had made her sharper, faster, stronger, but never softer, never safer. "I think I've spent my whole life becoming what people expected me to be," she said softly, "and now I'm not sure who I'd be without all of that." Earl's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe that's why you're here to find out." A long silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with meaning, like an old song they both knew, but hadn't sung yet. Later that afternoon, Claire found herself alone in the break room, wiping down the table when she noticed a small frame photo tucked between old repair manuals and a faded can of WD-40. It was of Earl and a woman with short auburn hair and a face full of laughter. Sarah Claire stared at the photo, heart clenching. When Earl returned, she was still holding it. "She was beautiful," Claire said. "She was more than that," he replied, setting down the grocery bag he'd just brought in. "She was curious. Brave, smarter than I'll ever be." Claire smiled. "She looks like she laughed a lot." "She did," Earl said, a quiet pride in his voice. "She taught me how to dance in the kitchen, said that if the world was ending, she'd rather go out while spinning to old records than sitting still." Claire set the photo down gently. "I've never danced in a kitchen," she said almost to herself. Earl poured her a cup of tea. "It's not too late." She looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. "Earl, do you ever wish you had a second chance?" He considered her question as he stirred honey into his tea. "No," he said after a pause. "I think I've had exactly the life I was supposed to live." But I do believe in giving other people their second chances when they're ready. Claire looked away, her eyes stinging unexpectedly. What if I don't know what I'd do with mine? Then stay here, he said quietly, until you figure it out. She nodded, unsure whether to smile or cry. She had come here thinking she was hiding, but maybe she was healing. Maybe the difference was in how it felt to be seen, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, not as a headline, just as Claire. The first snow of the season came without warning. It began as a quiet flurry in the afternoon, little more than a suggestion in the air, the kind of snow that locals called a whisper. But by early evening, it had thickened into heavy flakes, tumbling silently from the sky, blanketing the trees and softening the sharp edges of the world. Claire stood at the window of the back room, cradling a mug of cocoa. Earl had insisted on making his secret being a generous splash of cinnamon. Outside the garage, lights threw a halo across the falling snow, and everything beyond looked like a dream half remembered. "You ever seen it come down like this?" she asked as Earl stoked the fire behind her. "First snow always makes a statement," he said. "It's like the mountain reminding us we're not in charge." Claire smiled faintly. "I thought billion-dollar companies ran the world. Turns out the weather didn't get the memo." Earl chuckled as he stood dusting ash from his hands. "Snow's one of the few things left that doesn't care how rich you are." The wind picked up outside, rustling through the eaves and pressing against the glass. Claire turned from the window and wrapped the oversized cardigan tighter around herself. "We might lose power again," Earl said. "Already got extra wood and backup lanterns set. We'll be fine." Claire looked around the room. Modest old, a little worn in places, but warm, safe. There had been a time not long ago when the thought of staying anywhere without luxury sheets and climate control would have made her scoff. Now she couldn't imagine needing more than this. Dinner was simple baked potatoes and leftover stew. They ate quietly, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady beat of the storm against the roof. Afterward, Earl put on an old record player, and the soft sounds of Patsy Cline drifted into the room, mingling with the weather outside. Claire sat cross-legged on the floor, her mug resting on the rug beside her. "My mother used to play this when she cleaned the house," she said softly, except she always turned the volume up like she was trying to drown something out. "What do you think she was trying not to hear?" Claire stared into the fire. "Her regrets, maybe her exhaustion. The sound of an empty house after my dad left." Earl nodded but said nothing. He knew the value of silence better than anyone she'd ever met. The power flickered once, then held. Claire leaned her head back against the couch. "You know what's strange," she said. "What's that?" "I don't miss it. The snow. No. The life I left." Earl raised an eyebrow. "Already," she nodded slowly. "I thought I'd be anxious. Panicked. But there's no part of me that's looking at my phone wondering what's happening back there. For the first time, I'm not managing a disaster. I'm not planning 12 steps ahead. I'm just here." Earl leaned back in his chair, looking at her over the rim of his tea. "You're shedding." Claire blinked. "Excuse me." He smiled like an old dog, shedding everything that doesn't fit anymore. She laughed, caught off guard. "Are you calling me an old dog? I'm saying you're finally letting go." "That's a good thing," Claire shook her head, smiling. "You have a way of saying the simplest things like they're revelations." Earl didn't answer, just let the warmth between them stretch. The fire burned low. The record hissed and popped, then fell into silence. Outside, the wind howled louder now, rattling the window panes. Claire glanced toward the front of the garage. "Do you think we're snowed in?" Earl stood and walked to the door, opened it just wide enough to see the drift piling up against the step. "Likely," he said. "Road'll be buried until morning." She folded her arms, "And here I thought I might sneak away tonight." He turned the porch light, casting his face in gold. "Is that what you want?" Claire looked at him, her smile fading into something more vulnerable. "No," she said, "but that doesn't mean I'm not scared of what it means that I don't." He stepped back inside and closed the door behind him. "That's fair." She paced slowly toward the fire, her voice low. "I've been running for so long, I don't know who I am, without motion, without strategy. I keep waiting for the panic to set in, but it's not there." She turned to face him. You said once that healing isn't a destination, that it's a stop on the road. But what if I want to stay? Earl studied her for a long moment. Then you stay. Claire stepped closer to the fire, her eyes glinting in the glow. What if I don't know what comes next? Earl moved toward her, slow but sure. You don't have to. That's the point. There was a pause. A breath. Then Claire whispered, I almost kissed you that night in front of the fireplace. He didn't flinch. I know. Why didn't you let me? Earl's voice was gentle because you were still running, and I've learned not to build something on the back of a sprint. Claire's eyes shimmered, and now he stepped closer until the space between them was warm with more than firelight. Now he said softly, I think you finally stopped. The room held its breath, but this time it was Claire who stepped forward. Her hand found his, and for the first time she didn't feel like she was escaping something, but stepping toward it. There was no rush, no music, no cinematic kiss, just a quiet mutual understanding that something had shifted. A beginning, not rushed, not defined but real, and real, she now knew was enough. The morning after the snowstorm was silent in a sacred way. A blanket of white lay thick over the land, untouched, muffling every sound like nature was holding its breath. The trees, heavy with snow, bowed slightly under its weight, and the garage's tin roof sparkled with frost as the sun emerged shyly from behind the mountains. Claire stood on the porch, wrapped in Earl's quilted jacket, steam rising from her mug as she watched the light shift across the valley. Inside her chest, something unfamiliar stirred. Not anxiety, not duty, but something deeper, quieter. Peace. She hadn't thought it possible, not after the life she had led. Not after everything she had built, fought for, and ultimately fled. But here it was, in the crunch of fresh snow, in the way Earl hummed a country tune inside as he fried eggs, in the steadiness of a world that did not ask her to prove her worth. She didn't hear the sound at first. It was faint, hidden beneath the whistle of wind and the hiss of the stovetop inside. A buzz sharp, repeating. Then she heard it clearly, her phone. She had forgotten it even existed. Buried deep in the bag she'd thrown in the back of the pickup that day she walked away. The sound stopped, then started again. A vibration against the wooden floor of the porch where she dropped the bag without ceremony. Days ago. Her breath caught as she moved toward it, hands suddenly cold. She hesitated before reaching in 16. Missed calls, 12 voicemails, dozens of text messages from her assistant, her chief of operations, her security team, and then one name that made her stomach knot. Jeremy. Claire didn't press play. She didn't want to hear his voice, smooth, composed, concerned. She could picture his expression even now. Performative worry, not for her safety, but for the optics of her disappearance. She scrolled through the texts. Board is in emergency session. Press is spinning stories. Need a statement. You need to come back now. Where are you? She put the phone down, her hands trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper. The life she had left behind was still reaching for her, like a vine determined to wrap itself around her neck again. The door creaked open behind her. You okay? Earl asked. She turned to him, eyes glassy. They found me. Earl stepped out onto the porch, looked down at the phone and then at her. He didn't ask what was in the messages. He didn't have to. Claire sat on the step phone, dangling from her fingers. I forgot it was in my bag. It must have gotten a signal again after the storm passed. Earl sat beside her. You gonna answer? She shook her head. Not yet. They sat there for a long time in silence, the snow beginning to melt around them, water dripping softly from the eaves. I knew it wouldn't last forever, she said. This peace, this... Hiding. Earl didn't speak right away. Then he said, it's not hiding if you're healing. She turned to him, eyes fierce. But what if they come here? What if someone shows up with a camera with questions? Then we close the gate, he said calmly. Claire stared at him, disbelieving. You're not afraid of what this could mean for you? If they know you've been harboring me. He looked out over the snow-covered trees, unbothered. I didn't harbor you, Claire. You knocked on the world's quietest door, and I opened it. That's not a crime. That's just being human. Her throat tightened. They won't see it that way. He looked at her, then voice steady, then let them misunderstand. The people who matter already know the truth. Claire exhaled shakily. I want to stay here. I know, but I don't think I can. I know that too. She closed her eyes. I don't want to go back to being her. Then don't, but the world expects it. Earl reached over and gently took the phone from her hand, setting it down on the porch beside them. Maybe, he said, this is your chance to show the world a different version of her. The one you found here. The one who knows how to breathe. She swallowed the lump in her throat. I don't even know how to start. Start by not apologizing for leaving, he said. Start by telling the truth. Claire turned her face toward the sunlight. She could feel the warmth fighting its way through the chill. I'm scared, she admitted. So was I, Earl said. The first time I had to live without Sarah. The first time I woke up and realized I didn't know who I was without her, but I figured it out. One morning, one broken thing at a time. Claire nodded slowly. I think, she said, I want to be someone who fixes things too. Earl smiled. Then stay a little longer. Let the snow melt. Let your phone ring. It'll still be there when you're ready. She looked at him, at the crinkles around his eyes, the gray in his beard, the steady calm that felt like home, and something inside her settled. I'm not done here, she said. Earl stood, extended a hand. Then come help me rotate tires. Nothing like greasy work to remind you what's real. Claire laughed, taking his hand. The phone remained on the porch as they walked inside. It buzzed once more, a distant noise now, but Claire didn't hear it. She was listening to something else entirely, the sound of her life-changing shape. Quietly, completely. The sun broke through the gray the next morning, warm and blinding, scattering diamonds across the half-melted snow. Claire stood at the workbench in the garage, sleeves rolled up elbow-deep in a toolbox, humming softly, a tune she didn't realize she remembered. Earl watched her from a distance, hidden behind the hood of a rusty truck. There was something about the way she moved now, not hurried, not brittle. She reached for tools like they were old friends, not unfamiliar objects. She smiled more easily. She spoke less guardedly, and she'd started signing her name simply Claire in Earl's ledger when helping him keep track of parts. No titles, no last name, just Claire. But he had seen this before. He had seen the way people begin to glow when they feel safe, and how that same glow often meant they were almost ready to go. It was just after lunch when she found him on the porch, a folded piece of paper in one hand, her jacket in the other. Earl, she said, her voice quieter than usual. He looked up from his seat. You heading out? She nodded slowly. There's a flight in Denver tomorrow morning. I can't avoid it forever. He said nothing, just waited. I don't want to, she added, almost a whisper. Not because I'm afraid, but because I finally know who I am here, and I don't want to lose that. Earl nodded, looking past her to the valley beyond. You won't, he said, because it's not about this place. It's about what you chose to become while you were here. She swallowed. It feels like if I leave, I'll lose you too. He finally met her eyes, Claire. I was never something for you to lose. She looked at the ground, ashamed of the tears pressing against her lids. You've given me more than anyone ever has, she whispered, and you never asked for anything. That's the point, he said gently. Some things are meant to be given freely. Otherwise, they're not gifts. They're trades. She stepped forward, reaching into her jacket pocket and pulling out a small velvet pouch. She placed it in his palm. He opened it to find a thin silver key and a folded note. It's for the cottage I own near Mendocino, she said. By the cliffs, quiet, clean air. If you ever want to get away from the cold and rebuild something near the ocean, it's yours. No conditions. Earl held the key for a long moment, then closed his hand around it. I've never been good with oceans, he said. Too much space, too many unknowns. You'd be surprised, she replied, smiling. Sometimes standing at the edge of something wide is the only way to understand how far you've come. He chuckled softly. You sound like someone who's been reading fortune cookies. Just learning to listen, she said. To people like you. The goodbye lingered like the last note of a hymn. Claire didn't ask for a hug. Earl didn't offer one. But their hands touched as he took the key, and in that small, unspoken gesture was every thank you, almost every truth neither had dared to say aloud. The next morning she was gone. No note, no dramatic farewell, just a clean kitchen, a refolded quilt, and a fresh pot of coffee already brewing. Earl found her phone sitting on the table, fully charged, screen dark, and next to it a single photograph. It was one he hadn't taken. It showed the two of them, Claire sitting on the workbench, Earl beside her, both laughing, a grease-smudged wrench in her hand. Someone must have snapped it from outside the bay window. He smiled faintly, slipping the photo into his wallet. Outside, the sun melted the last traces of snow. The world returned to motion, and so did he. That afternoon, he rolled up his sleeves and went back to work. The El Camino needed new brake lines, and there was no point letting rust win. He didn't expect to hear from her. He didn't wait for it, because some goodbyes don't need words. Some goodbyes are seeds planted quietly, so that something greater might grow later. Winter moved in fully over the valley's sharp winds and pale skies. Days that felt shorter and nights that crept in early. Earl adjusted as he always had. He brought in more firewood, replaced a broken pane in the garage window, and kept the kettle full. The rhythm of life returned steady and unremarkable. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't the quiet of peace anymore. It was the quiet of absence. A space once filled, now emptied. Claire had left without ceremony. No note, no goodbye. And Earl respected that. But some part of him had held on to the scent of her shampoo, lingering on the borrowed flannel. The mug she'd always used still tucked near the coffee maker. He didn't move it, didn't wash it, didn't quite know why. People came and went in his life, always had travelers with busted tires, folks with engine lights blinking in desperation. They all passed through. But Claire had never felt like someone passing through, and still she had gone. He never said it out loud, but he checked the road most mornings. Just a glance. Just in case. Then one gray morning, something changed. The mail came late, dropped off by Dan Hawkins, the semi-retired postman who had delivered letters in these parts for 30 years. He handed Earl a thick envelope. Fancy stamp, Dan said, raising an eyebrow. Looks like it came from a law office. Earl took it, nodded his thanks, and tucked it under his arm. He didn't open it until after dinner. He sat at the small table by the window with a glass of cider, the stove ticking quietly behind him. When he slid open the envelope, several papers slipped out, legal documents, typed in that formal, almost lifeless font. At the top was her name, Claire E. Lockwood. He read it twice to be sure. Then again, she hadn't written a letter, not in the traditional sense, but she'd left a message in the form that mattered most in her world. Deeds, transfers, blueprints. He stared at the included map, a sketch of the property lines surrounding his garage with careful notations and an architectural overlay. She'd bought it, not just the land, the entire valley curve. And in the margin, in careful handwritten print, she'd written, "You once told me everything broken can be rebuilt. I'd like to help you prove it." There was a second sheet, a short letter in her own hand, shaky but sure. "Earl, you didn't ask for anything. That's why I wanted to give something back. This place gave me my breath again. It gave me back myself. The land is yours now on paper and in truth. Do with it what you always wanted. Build, heal. Share it with those who need it the way I did. If I ever find my way back again, I hope the coffee's still strong and the porch light still works." Claire Earl sat back, the letter in one hand, the deed in the other, and for a long while he didn't move. Not out of shock, but reverence. He thought of Sarah, of the porch conversations they used to have, dreaming aloud about one day opening a little learning shop for kids who didn't do well in traditional schools, a place where you taught with tools, not textbooks, where no one had to wear a mask. That dream had faded with her loss. But now in ink and intention, Claire had returned it to him. He folded the papers, gently placed them on the table, and walked out into the cold night. The stars above the garage blinked steady and ancient. He lit the porch light. The next few weeks were busy, not the kind of busy that wore a man down, but the kind that breathed purpose into his bones. Earl called in a few favors, reached out to an architect in Jackson he'd once helped during a snowstorm. They talked about open workshop spaces, classrooms, and outdoor area for teaching kids how to rebuild engines in confidence at the same time. He didn't tell anyone where the money came from. He didn't have to. Those who came to help sensed the spirit of the place. It wasn't corporate, it wasn't promotional, it was personal. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, something started to grow. People from town dropped by more often curious at first than volunteering. Dan helped haul lumber. A high school teacher offered to coordinate field trips. Even the grizzled old biker who'd once cursed Earl out over a busted muffler showed up with a donation of tools and 2 cases of soda. One afternoon, Earl opened the ledger Claire used to sign. In the margin of her last entry, she had scribbled, "Real things don't rust." He smiled at that. She was wrong technically, everything rusted. But maybe she meant something deeper. Maybe she meant people. He tucked the page into a new notebook, the one he'd started for the project he now called the Rebuild Initiative. It wasn't about charity, it wasn't about legacy. It was about wholeness, about what happened when you gave people tools, not just to fix machines, but to fix the pieces of themselves the world had told them were beyond repair. And as Earl looked out the window watching the snow begin to fall again in soft, unhurried flakes, he realized something profound. Claire hadn't just given him a piece of land, she had given him back his purpose. And maybe, just maybe, she had planted a path home. By early spring, the snow had retreated into the higher elevations, and the air in the valley carried the scent of thawed soil and sawdust. Earl's land, once just a quiet lot with an aging garage, was now a place of purpose. The transformation hadn't been dramatic, no flashy signage or groundbreaking ceremonies, but it was real, and it bore his name. The first time Earl saw the engraved plaque, he stood in silence for a long time. It had been delivered by truck hand-carved in oak, mounted on a sturdy post near the path that led to the newly framed community workshop. The sign read, "Danner Workshop, a place to rebuild," below it in smaller letters. Inspired by quiet hands and unspoken kindness. He hadn't asked for that. Claire had arranged it, no doubt. He ran a hand across the wood, the texture smooth under his calloused fingers. A mix of pride and disbelief rose in him, tempered by the humility that came from a life that had rarely offered him praise. He didn't cry, but something in him softened. He could almost hear Sarah's voice beside him. "Would you look at that, Earl? You finally let someone honor you and the world didn't fall apart." He smiled to himself, blinking at the horizon where golden light spilled over the pines. It was happening. A dream he had quietly tucked away under grief and practicality. A place where young people could learn skills that weren't graded by standardized tests, and adults who'd lost their footing could get their hands dirty and feel useful again. The blueprints Claire had left behind weren't just physical, they were spiritual. She had sketched a future that had once seemed beyond his reach and signed it over to him with quiet trust. But the truth was, she hadn't just left blueprints. She had left fingerprints. Every corner of the space bore traces of her, the natural light design in the side workshop, her idea. The garden out back where they planned to grow vegetables and teach sustainability, her suggestion over late-night tea. The small corner room labeled Quiet Space, born from the silence they once shared beside the fireplace. Earl had never known someone who could disappear and still leave so much presence behind. That made what happened next all the more surreal. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Earl was on the roof fixing a gutter before the spring rain set in. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel but thought little of it. People came and went now, volunteering or donating supplies. But when he glanced down, his breath caught. It wasn't a pickup. It wasn't a contractor's van. It was a limousine, black gleaming out of place among the dust and pine needles. The door opened slowly, and she stepped out. Claire. Not the CEO in stilettos and silk. Not the woman who had fled into the woods weeks ago. But Claire as he remembered her, wearing jeans, a soft gray sweater, and boots that had seen real ground. Her hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, wind-tousled. Her expression was unreadable. For a moment, Earl didn't move. Then he climbed down slow and careful, heart pounding, not with nerves, but with something closer to wonder. They met halfway in the yard. Neither spoke. She smiled first. "Nice sign," she said softly. He nodded. "I didn't make it. I know," she said. "But you deserve it." They stood in the silence between them, the weight of their history pressing gently into the space. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," Earl said. "I wasn't sure I was allowed to," Claire replied. He tilted his head. Aloud I left, she said without a word. After everything you gave me, I didn't even say goodbye. Earl gave her a long look. You didn't need to. She swallowed. But I wanted to. He took a breath. So why now? Claire looked around at the frame workshop, the blooming daffodils near the porch, the smell of sawdust still fresh in the air. I had to see what you built, she said. And I had to see if it still felt like home. Earl didn't speak right away, then gently. And does it? Her eyes found his, steady and searching. It does, she whispered. Because you're still here. Something broke open then. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. Claire reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folder. These are the final transfer papers. The lawyers made it more complicated than it needed to be, but the property's fully yours now. No ties, no tricks. Earl looked at the papers and then back at her. You came all this way to deliver that. I came all this way, she said, her voice shaking slightly because I realized I built empires to feel seen. But I never felt known until I met you. Earl stepped closer. She didn't flinch. I've been building something too, he said quietly. Not just walls and roofs. Something here. He tapped his chest. Something I didn't think I had left. Claire looked down, blinking quickly. I'm not asking for anything. Earl, I just wanted to show up. Honestly, this time without running. He nodded slowly. Then stay for dinner. No promises, no speeches, just stew and cornbread. She laughed through the tears. You still make that awful weak tea. Not anymore, he said, upgraded, and together they walked toward the porch, side by side. No titles, no headlines, no stage, just Claire, just Earl. And the place they had built together and apart, waiting quietly to welcome them both back in. The sky turned golden in the hour before dusk, the kind of light that made everything look touched by grace. The wind had settled, the clouds pulled back, like curtains revealing a wide, quiet sky above Earl's land. Claire stood by the edge of the new workshop, her boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the other side of the property, where a group of teens had spent the afternoon rebuilding a dirt bike someone had found half buried in an old barn. A year ago, she would have thought this kind of scene quaint, distant from the world she knew. Now it felt like the most important place she'd ever stood. Inside the shop, Earl was at work beneath the hood of a battered minivan, brought in by a single mother from town. He was whistling a low, tuneless melody that he probably didn't realize he repeated when he was focused. Claire watched him for a moment before stepping inside. Need a second set of hands, she asked. He glanced up, smiling. Only if you promise not to strip the bolt like last time. She raised an eyebrow. That bolt was already stripped. I just confirmed it. He laughed and moved aside. She took her place beside him, slipping on a pair of gloves. The action had become familiar now, as natural as she once felt, walking into a boardroom. They worked in tandem, saying little. The radio played something soft in the background, folk guitar, and a voice that sounded like a memory. Eventually, Earl leaned back and wiped his forehead. You staying long this time? Claire didn't answer right away. She leaned against the workbench, her expression thoughtful. I'm not staying, she said. Earl stilled. But before he could reply, she added, I'm not staying. I'm coming home. He looked at her, something unspoken, tightening in his chest. I went back for a while, she continued. Wrapped things up, told the board. I wasn't coming back. Transferred control. Donated my shares to an educational foundation. Bought a place nearby. Nothing fancy. A cottage with a view of the hills. I even got a dog. Earl blinked. A dog, Claire nodded. A rescue. Mutt ugly as sin. Sleeps like a drunk toddler. You'll love him, he chuckled softly. You really left it all behind. I didn't leave it behind, she said. I chose something better. Her voice lowered, rich with emotion. I chose a life that doesn't ask me to perform. One where quiet is not emptiness, but peace. One where someone makes weak tea and terrible jokes and reminds me that being still doesn't mean being stuck. Earl looked at her, and in his eyes was something he rarely allowed himself to feel: hope. I didn't think you'd come back, he said softly. Claire stepped closer. I didn't come back because I missed what we had. I came back because I know what we can build. She placed a small folded paper in his hand. He opened it slowly, It was a hand-drawn sketch, rough marked in pencil. 2 buildings, a central courtyard, a greenhouse. The Claire Lockwood Center for Practical Learning, she said. That's what the donors will see. He looked up at her, brow raised. But the kids, she said with a smile, they'll just call it the Fix-It Place, and you'll run it. Earl stared at the sketch, the lines wobbly but full of vision. Claire reached for his hand. Not alone, she added. We'll run it. The workshop was quiet except for the creak of cooling metal and the hum of something much deeper. A future not imagined, but already in motion. Outside, the porch light flickered on. They walked out together as the sun dipped low behind the pines. The gravel path was lined with soft footprints, their prints now overlapping side by side. Claire paused halfway to the house. When I first came here, she said, voice low, I was barefoot, bleeding, and lost. Earl turned to her, and now she smiled, a warmth radiating from her that made the twilight feel almost like morning. Now I walk with purpose. He took her hand gently, and you're not alone. She leaned into his shoulder, and together they walked the final steps toward the porch, not hurried, not afraid, just homeward. Later that evening, long after the dishes were done and the kettle had cooled, Earl stepped outside one last time. The stars shimmered overhead. The land, once silent, now pulsed with the promise of all they'd build. He glanced back at the house where Claire was curled on the couch, a book in her lap, a dog snoring at her feet. The porch light glowed softly, still on, still welcoming, still waiting for the next lost soul who might wander in and find something unexpected. Not rescue, not redemption, just kindness. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. We'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Did this story touch your heart in some way, or remind you of someone special in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, full of kindness, healing, and unexpected connection, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing community. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Until next time, take care and never underestimate the power of a quiet act of kindness.